Pack it up. We're done. The order echoed across the rain-soaked command post just before sunrise. Search volunteers stopped where they were. A rescue dog handler unclipped his partner's vest. Someone quietly folded a large topographic map that had been opened and closed hundreds of times over the past 6 days. The helicopter circled the valley one final time before disappearing behind the mountains. The search for Evelyn Harrow was officially over. No one argued. The storm that had rolled through 2 nights earlier had erased nearly every usable trace. Hundreds of volunteers, state police, park rangers, and aviation crews had covered thousands of acres without finding a single piece of evidence that answered the only question that mattered. Was she still alive? Nolan Mercer stood near the edge of the gravel parking area, watching vehicles file onto the narrow mountain road. His backpack rested against one boot. Inside were a compass, a weatherproof notebook, spare batteries, a first aid kit, and enough food to last another day. A sheriff's deputy walked over and gave him a tired smile. You heading home, too? Nolan looked beyond the empty command tents toward the western ridge line, hidden beneath low clouds. In a minute, the search grid's finished. I know you work these mountains better than most people. If we missed something, we'd have found it by now. Nolan didn't answer. He simply nodded. The deputy climbed into his truck and drove away. Within minutes, the once crowded staging area became almost silent. Before we go any further, I'd love to know something about you. How old are you? Where are you watching from? And have you ever found yourself in a situation where everyone else believed it was time to quit? Nolan unfolded one of the discarded search maps lying on a folding table. Colored lines covered nearly every section of the reserve. Nearly one steep drainage basin along the western slope had only a thin pencil note beside it. High rockfall risk. Limited ground access. Air search only. He traced the contour lines with one finger. Something bothered him. Not because the decision had been careless. It hadn't. Search leaders had made the safest choice with the information they had. But mountains rarely cared about reasonable assumptions. His phone vibrated. Lucy calling. He answered before the second ring. Morning, sweetheart. His 9-year-old daughter sounded sleepy. Grandma says, "You're coming home today." That's the plan. They didn't find the lady. No. A long pause filled the line. Does that mean nobody's looking anymore? Nolan closed his eyes. Years ago, another search had ended with almost the same words. Back then, he had packed his gear, driven home, and tried to convince himself that there was nothing else anyone could have done. He had never completely believed it. I think everyone has done everything they safely could, he finally said. Lucy was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Is that the same as doing everything?" The question settled deeper than she could have known. Nolan looked once more at the untouched drainage basin on the map. It wasn't hope pulling him toward the mountain. It wasn't guilt either. It was one unanswered question. What if the safest place to stop searching wasn't the right place to stop? He folded the map, tightened the straps on his backpack, and walked away from the empty command post. This time, he wasn't following the search. He was following the one place the search had never truly reached. The farther Nolan Mercer climbed, the quieter the mountain became. Within half an hour, the sounds of trucks, radios, and departing volunteers had completely disappeared. Only the steady rhythm of rainwater dripping from pine branches followed him through the forest. He welcomed the silence. It forced him to pay attention. Most people believed finding someone in the wilderness depended on luck. Nolan had spent nearly 15 years maintaining flood monitoring stations and surveying unstable terrain throughout the reserve. He had learned something different. People missed clues because they searched for objects. The mountain revealed patterns. He stopped beside a shallow creek swollen by recent storms. The current moved faster than normal, carrying broken branches downstream. Kneeling near the bank, he studied the mud instead of the water. Fresh footprints were impossible after 2 days of heavy rain. But the creek itself told a story. One side of the bank had collapsed more recently than the other. Small stones had rolled into the water, leaving sharp edges untouched by moss. A cluster of reeds leaned against the current, as though something large had pushed through them before the last rainfall. Not proof, just possibility. He wrote a few notes inside his weatherproof notebook before continuing uphill. Around mid-morning, clouds lifted enough to reveal the western ridge line. It looked exactly as the search map described. Steep, broken, dangerous, easy to avoid. Nolan understood why the incident commander had limited ground teams here. Sending dozens of volunteers across unstable rock could have created a second emergency. That decision still made sense. What bothered him wasn't the decision. It was the assumption behind it. Everyone had worked backward from the established survey route Evelyn Harrow was supposed to follow. What if she never reached that route in the first place? His phone vibrated. One message from his mother. Lucy finished breakfast. She's worried about you, but pretending she isn't. Nolan smiled. That sounded exactly like his daughter. He typed a quick reply. Tell her I'll call this afternoon. Before putting the phone away, he noticed an old photograph tucked inside the notebook cover. It showed two young park employees standing beside a trail bridge years earlier. One was Nolan, the other was Aaron Pike. Aaron had been the first person to teach him how to read unstable ground instead of simply walking across it. 8 years ago, Aaron disappeared while inspecting flood damage after a spring storm. The search lasted 3 days. On the fourth morning, officials called it off because another storm was moving in. Nolan remembered packing his truck without saying much. He remembered convincing himself that experienced professionals always knew when enough was enough. Aaron's body wasn't discovered until nearly a week later, less than a mile outside the final search boundary. That distance had never stopped haunting him. Not because he believed anyone had acted carelessly, because every search eventually reached a point where someone had to choose between acceptable risk and impossible hope. There was no perfect answer, only decisions people had to live with afterward. Nolan had promised himself something at Aaron's memorial. If he ever possessed a reasonable reason to keep looking, he would. Not forever, not recklessly, but long enough to know he wasn't walking away simply because everyone else already had. The terrain grew steeper as noon approached. He left the faint maintenance trail and moved carefully across a slope littered with loose shale. Every few steps, he tested the ground with a walking stick before shifting his weight. Then he noticed something unusual. A narrow line of mountain grass had been flattened against the natural direction of the wind. Most people would never have looked twice. Nolan crouched beside it. The stems weren't broken. They had been pressed down. Not by an animal, not by falling rock, by steady weight moving across the hillside. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to slow down. Excitement had caused more mistakes in the wilderness than exhaustion ever had. He looked beyond the flattened grass. Farther upslope, a section of exposed earth carried a faint scar where runoff had changed direction after the storm. It wasn't enough to prove someone had passed through. But for the first time that morning, the mountain wasn't merely asking questions. It was beginning to answer them. Nolan stayed where he was for several minutes, studying the hillside before taking another step. The flattened grass could mean many things. A fallen branch, a deer crossing after the rain, or someone desperately trying to keep their balance. The mountain never rewarded assumptions. It rewarded patience. He circled the area instead of walking straight through it, careful not to disturb anything that might matter later. A few yards uphill, the slope narrowed between two clusters of weather-beaten fir trees. That was where he noticed the first real inconsistency. Rainwater should have carved shallow channels directly downhill. Instead, one narrow stream bent sharply to the west before disappearing beneath loose rock. Nolan crouched and traced the path with his eyes. Something had redirected the water. Not permanently. Recently, he climbed another 20 feet and found the answer. A section of earth had collapsed after the storm, exposing fresh stone beneath the surface. Along the edge of the slide, several young shrubs had been bent in the same direction, their roots still gripping the wet soil. He wasn't looking at a simple landslide. He was looking at a landscape that had changed after the search teams mapped the area. He unfolded the official search grid from his backpack. The contour lines confirmed what he had begun to suspect. Every organized team had approached the western slope from below because before the storm, it offered the safest route. But the landslide had quietly erased that route. If Evelyn Harrow had been caught here before the ground gave way, the mountain itself could have pushed her into terrain that no longer matched the original search plan. Nolan slowly folded the map. No one had searched the wrong place. They had searched the right place for yesterday's mountain. Today's mountain was different. A raven circled high overhead before disappearing beyond the ridge. The wind shifted, carrying the sharp scent of fresh cedar mixed with damp stone. Nolan adjusted his backpack and moved toward the edge of the slide. The descent looked dangerous. Loose shale covered most of the slope and several large boulders rested at uneasy angles. Waiting for gravity to make the next decision, he searched for another way. Nearly 15 minutes later, he discovered a narrow game trail. Weaving through thick brush. Deer had worn the path over many seasons, avoiding the unstable ground while naturally following the mountain's safest contours. He smiled quietly. Animals often solve problems long before people realize they existed. The trail curved behind a wall of dense evergreens where sunlight barely reached the forest floor. As Nolan stepped into the shade, something caught his attention. A strip of bright orange fabric fluttered gently from the branch of a young pine. It wasn't tied there. It had been torn free. He carefully lifted it between two fingers. The material felt lightweight but durable, the kind often used inside high-end outdoor jackets. He didn't recognize it. He didn't need to. More important was where it had been caught. The branch stood nearly shoulder high. Whatever had snagged the fabric hadn't been carried by flood water. It had passed through here. Nolan sealed the fragment inside a small evidence pouch before scanning the surrounding ground. A few feet away, 3 fist-sized stones rested in an almost perfect line across a patch of exposed dirt. Nature occasionally made strange patterns. This didn't feel like one of them. He knelt without touching the stones. Someone under pressure might not have left a written message, but they might have left the simplest signal possible. Not a cry for help, a direction. For the first time since leaving the command post, Nolan no longer believed he was following a possibility. He believed he was following another person's decisions. And if those decisions were intentional, then somewhere beyond the ridge someone had fought very hard to stay alive. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered once again above the western ridge. The mountain seemed determined to erase every trace before nightfall. Nolan slipped the small evidence pouch into his backpack and looked at the line of stones one last time. If they had been placed by a person, they weren't meant to impress anyone. They were meant to survive the rain. He stood and quietly followed the direction they pointed. The deer trail narrowed until low branches brushed against his shoulders. Wet leaves soaked his jacket as he moved deeper into terrain untouched by the official search. His phone vibrated. Only one bar of signal remained. "Lucy." He answered immediately. "Hey, Peanut." Her voice carried the familiar mix of confidence and worry. "Grandma made grilled cheese. That sounds better than my lunch. Did you eat anything?" Nolan looked at the unopened sandwich still tucked inside his backpack. "Not yet." "I knew it." He laughed softly. "I'll eat." She hesitated before asking, "Are you still looking?" "Yes." Another pause. "Do you think she's still alive?" Nolan rested one hand against the rough bark of a cedar tree. "I don't. No. You always tell me not to pretend I know things when I don't." "That's true. So why are you still there?" He looked toward the steep ravine, disappearing into the trees. "Because I haven't found a good reason to stop." Lucy was quiet. Then she said something that stayed with him. "If you come home, I'll still be here." He closed his eyes for a second. "I know, but if she's out there," she didn't finish the sentence. "She didn't have to." "I love you," Nolan said. "Love you too, Dad." The signal disappeared before either of them could say goodbye again. He slipped the silent phone into his pocket and opened the sandwich as promised. A few quick bites were enough. Clear thinking mattered more than moving fast. The trail ended beside a narrow rock wall where rainwater disappeared into a deep crack in the mountain. At first, it looked like another dead end. Then Nolan noticed a cool breeze drifting outward from the opening. Airflow. There was open space somewhere beyond. He examined the ground instead of forcing his way inside. Fresh gravel rested on top of older pine needles. Tiny fragments of bark had collected against one edge of the crack. Something had passed through after the last storm. Not an animal. The opening was too narrow for deer, not falling debris. The movement had come from inside toward the outside. Nolan removed his flashlight, but didn't switch it on yet. He crouched, studying every inch of the entrance before making a decision. The safest choice would be to turn back before darkness made the terrain even more dangerous. The easiest choice would be to convince himself someone else could search here tomorrow. But tomorrow was built on one assumption, that whoever might be beyond the rocks could survive one more night. Nolan wasn't willing to make that assumption. He tightened the straps of his backpack, switched on the lowest beam of his flashlight, and slowly stepped through the narrow opening, leaving the fading daylight behind as the mountain closed quietly around him. The passage beyond the narrow crack twisted deeper into the mountain than Nolan had expected. He kept his flashlight pointed low, letting the dim beam trace the uneven floor instead of the walls. Wet limestone reflected enough light to reveal loose rocks, shallow pools, and narrow ledges carved by years of underground water. Every step was deliberate. The cave wasn't silent. Water dripped steadily from somewhere ahead. A faint breeze drifted through the darkness, carrying cool, damp air that smelled of stone and cedar roots. The airflow reassured him. It meant there was another opening somewhere beyond. He paused at a fork where the passage divided into two narrow corridors. Instead of choosing immediately, he switched off the flashlight. Darkness surrounded him. He listened. The left passage echoed with running water. The right remained almost completely still. Then, just beneath the sound of the distant stream, he heard something else. A scrape. Not loud, not repeated, just enough to tell him that something had disturbed the silence. He waited another full minute. Nothing. He turned the flashlight back on and followed the quieter passage. The tunnel gradually widened until he entered a chamber no larger than a living room. The ceiling opened high above him where a narrow fracture allowed faint gray evening light to filter inside. Plants had somehow taken root near the opening, their leaves reaching toward the thin strip of sky. Nolan slowly swept the beam across the chamber. A pile of carefully stacked branches rested against one wall. Someone had arranged them. Nearby sat several smooth stones surrounding the remains of a tiny emergency candle long since burned out. No wildfire, no campfire, just enough light to conserve energy. His heartbeat quickened. These weren't random signs left by chance. They were decisions. Every object in the chamber suggested the same thing. Whoever had sheltered here wasn't wandering blindly. They were trying to survive. Nolan crouched beside the candle. The wax still held fingerprints pressed into one side where someone had steadied it before lighting the wick. A folded energy bar wrapper rested nearby, weighted beneath a flat stone to keep it from blowing away. The wrapper belonged to a premium outdoor brand often carried by experienced hikers. He didn't reach for it. There would be time later to preserve evidence. Right now, finding the person mattered more than documenting every clue. He looked beyond the chamber. Another narrow opening disappeared into darkness. The cool air flow seemed stronger there. He stepped closer. Then he stopped. A faint cough echoed somewhere ahead. So quiet it almost blended with the wind. Nolan remained perfectly still. He didn't call out. He knew how easily fear could overwhelm someone isolated for nearly a week. Instead, he set his backpack on the ground where it could be clearly seen if anyone looked toward the chamber. He removed a sealed bottle of water and placed it on a flat rock several feet in front of him. Then he stepped back. "My name is Nolan," he said calmly. His voice carried without becoming a shout. "I'm by myself." Silence answered. "I work in the reserve." "Nothing. I found signs that someone came this way." Several long seconds passed. Then another cough. Closer this time. Weak. Followed by the sound of a small stone shifting across the cave floor. Nolan resisted every instinct to rush forward. Trust could not be forced, especially not after days of isolation. "I'm not coming any closer," he continued. "I just want you to know you aren't alone anymore." The chamber fell silent once again. Then, from somewhere beyond the darkness came a single whisper. So, someone kept looking. Nolan closed his eyes for the briefest moment. Every clue, every difficult decision, every mile across the mountain had led to this quiet sentence. He opened his eyes and answered with complete honesty. Yes. No promises, no dramatic speeches, only the truth. "I did." Nolan didn't move. The voice had answered him. That alone was enough. He kept his flashlight pointed toward the ground, allowing only a soft circle of light to reach the chamber. The last thing he wanted was to overwhelm someone who had spent nearly a week in darkness. "My backpack is right here," he said calmly. "There's water and a first aid kit. I'm going to leave them where they are." A weak breath echoed from beyond the narrow opening. "You can come a little closer." Nolan picked up the bottle of water and took only 3 slow steps before stopping again. The dim light finally reached her. Evelyn Harrow leaned against the stone wall with one knee bent awkwardly beneath a slab of broken rock. Her navy field jacket was torn across one shoulder and dried mud covered most of her clothes. Her face looked pale from exhaustion, but her eyes remained alert. She hadn't given up. She had simply run out of strength. Nolan gently placed the bottle within her reach. "You need small sips." She nodded. Her hands trembled as she opened the bottle. After several careful drinks, she closed her eyes and let out a long breath. "I kept hearing helicopters. They searched for days. I tried yelling. The storm was louder." She looked down at the floor. "I thought maybe I imagined them after a while." "You didn't." Silence settled comfortably between them. Nolan knelt several feet away and studied the rocks trapping her leg. He never touched them. Years of surveying unstable terrain told him everything he needed to know. The stones weren't simply heavy. They supported one another. Moving the wrong one could shift the entire pile. He slowly circled the collapse, checking every angle. The fracture above them had already released once. It could release again. Finally, he looked back at Evelyn. "I can't move these safely by myself." She gave a tired smile. "I figured that out on the first day, but I know where you are now." Her eyes met his. "Does that matter?" "It changes everything." He removed an emergency blanket from his backpack and unfolded it carefully around her shoulders before checking the supplies she had managed to save. Half a bottle of collected rainwater, 2 unopened energy bars, a small notebook, 1 flashlight with fading batteries. She had survived not through luck but through discipline. "You planned every day," Nolan observed. "I kept telling myself morning would come." It did. Not fast enough. He smiled faintly. "No mountain has ever cared about our schedules." For the first time, she laughed. It was quiet and short, but real. Nolan checked his phone. No signal. He had expected that. He unfolded the topographic map across a flat rock and traced the route back to the narrow ridge where he had briefly received 1 bar of service earlier that afternoon. It was nearly 2 miles away, across unstable ground in darkness. He hated the decision forming in his mind. "If I stay here," he said honestly, "nobody knows where you are. If you leave, I can bring the rescue team back." She stared at the map for several seconds. "You'll have to leave me alone." "I know." Another silence followed. Neither of them searched for comforting words that neither could guarantee. Finally, Evelyn reached for the whistle clipped to Nolan's backpack. He unclipped it and placed it in her hand. 3 short blasts if something changes," he said. "And you?" "1 blast when I'm close enough to answer." She wrapped her fingers around the whistle and nodded. No promises, no impossible assurances, only a simple plan built on trust. Nolan stood, memorizing every rock, every turn, and every landmark inside the hidden chamber before switching his flashlight toward the passage. As he disappeared into the darkness, one thought stayed with him. Finding Evelyn had never been the finish line. Now he had to make sure the mountain didn't take her before the sunrise could. The mountain felt colder on the way back. Not because the temperature had dropped, but because Nolan now knew someone was waiting in the darkness behind him. He replayed every turn in his mind. The narrow passage, the split in the tunnel, the chamber with the burned-out candle, the loose boulder beside the underground stream. He repeated the landmarks silently, refusing to trust memory alone. Outside the cave, night had settled completely over the western ridge. A thin mist drifted through the trees, softening every outline and making familiar ground seem unfamiliar. Nolan stopped just long enough to stack 3 small rocks beside the cave entrance. Not for himself, for the rescue team. If daylight changed the appearance of the hillside, the marker might save precious minutes. He continued climbing. Loose shells shifted beneath his boots, forcing him to slow down. Twice he caught himself reaching for branches that snapped away under his weight. Speed no longer mattered. A twisted ankle now would leave both of them trapped. Halfway up the ridge, he paused to catch his breath and looked back toward the valley. Nothing. No lights, no helicopters, no voices, only darkness stretching across the mountains. His phone remained silent. No signal. He slipped it back into his pocket and kept moving. An hour later, he reached the narrow overlook where the ridge opened toward the eastern valley. He pulled out his phone again. Still nothing. He climbed onto a broad slab of granite, raising the device above his head. One faint bar appeared, then disappeared. He waited. Another bar flickered back. Without hesitating, he typed the shortest message possible. Missing subject alive. Western drainage basin beyond old survey ridge. Trapped beneath rockfall. Technical rescue required. I will guide the team at first light. Nolan Mercer. He pressed send. The screen displayed one word. Sending. The signal vanished. Nolan didn't move. 5 long seconds passed. 10-15. Then the phone vibrated once. Delivered. He exhaled slowly. No celebration. No relief yet. One message couldn't rescue anyone. He immediately started back toward the hidden chamber. The return trip felt even longer. Clouds covered the moon, forcing him to rely entirely on his flashlight. At one steep section, a loose rock slid beneath his boot and disappeared into the darkness below. He froze until the echo faded. One careless step could end the rescue before it began. Hours seemed to pass between each landmark. The split cedar, the narrow deer trail, the collapsed washout. Finally, he spotted the small stack of rocks he had left near the cave entrance. He stopped. 3 short whistle blasts echoed from deep inside the mountain. Sharp, weak, but unmistakable. Nolan immediately raised his own whistle. One clear blast answered. Silence followed. Then another faint whistle. Only one. She had heard him. He crawled back through the narrow opening and found Evelyn exactly where he had left her, wrapped inside the emergency blanket. She managed a tired smile. I wasn't sure you'd hear me. I said I would answer. I know. She looked at his face. You reached someone. He nodded. The message went through. For the first time since they met, the tension in her shoulders eased. Not because she believed everything would be easy from here. Because she no longer had to carry hope alone. Nolan handed her the remaining bottle of water and one unopened energy bar. They'll need daylight to reach us safely. She nodded. I can make it until then. I know you can. Either of them spoke again for several minutes. Outside, the wind moved quietly through the pines above the hidden chamber. Somewhere beyond the ridge, rescue crews were preparing equipment they didn't yet know they would need. Inside the mountain, 2 strangers waited in silence. Not for a miracle, but for the sunrise that would finally connect one determined decision with everyone who had another chance to help. A faint gray light crept through the narrow crack high above the chamber. Dawn was coming. Nolan checked his watch. 5:41 a.m. The rescue team would have received his message hours earlier, but reaching the western drainage basin was another challenge entirely. There were no marked trails leading here, no roads wide enough for rescue vehicles, and no place for a helicopter to land safely beneath the dense canopy. Every minute mattered. Evelyn stirred beneath the emergency blanket. "You never slept." Nolan smiled faintly. "I've had busier nights." She managed a tired laugh before wincing as pain shot through her trapped leg. He handed her another small sip of water. Slowly, she obeyed without argument. The discipline that had kept her alive for 6 days was still there. Outside the hidden chamber, a distant sound drifted through the forest. Not wind, metal striking rock. Then another. Nolan immediately stood. "They're here." He picked up his whistle and gave one long blast. Several seconds passed. Then, somewhere beyond the mountain, 3 whistles answered. Professional rescue signals. He looked back at Evelyn. They found the entrance. Relief flashed across her face, but Nolan gently raised one hand. "They still have to reach us." The terrain between the cave entrance and the chamber remained dangerous. Loose stone, narrow passages, unstable rock. He walked back toward the entrance and switched on his flashlight. "Follow my voice," he called. "This way." The first rescuer appeared several minutes later, wearing a climbing helmet and carrying technical rope equipment. "You Nolan Mercer? Yeah, you did one hell of a job marking the route. I just stacked rocks where the terrain changed." The rescuer nodded. "Those stacks probably saved us 20 minutes. More rescuers emerged behind him, carefully carrying medical packs, stabilization braces, lifting airbags, and portable communication equipment. No one rushed. Every movement was measured. Inside the chamber, the lead paramedic immediately knelt beside Evelyn. "My name's Sarah. We're going to take care of you." While the medical team checked her condition, 2 rescue specialists examined the collapsed rock. One quietly spoke to Nolan. "You were right not to move anything. The pile's unstable. It would have shifted." Nolan looked toward Evelyn. He hadn't saved her by pulling harder. He had saved her by knowing when not to. The rescue operation lasted nearly 3 hours. Inflatable lifting bags gently raised the largest slab, while stabilization struts secured the surrounding rock. Inch by inch, the pressure trapping Evelyn's leg eased until the medical team carefully lifted her free. She gasped but remained conscious. The paramedics wrapped her leg, secured her to a rescue litter, and prepared the slow journey back through the narrow passage. Before leaving the chamber, Evelyn looked toward Nolan. Either of them spoke. Words weren't necessary. A small nod carried everything neither one needed to explain. Outside, the first full light of morning spread across the western ridge. The rescue crew moved carefully down the marked route Nolan had discovered the previous day. At the overlook, additional responders waited with specialized equipment to transfer Evelyn to a helicopter positioned in a nearby clearing. The flight crew focused entirely on the patient. No cameras, no applause, no dramatic celebration, only quiet professionalism. As the helicopter lifted into the pale blue morning sky, Nolan remained standing near the edge of the ridge. A deputy sheriff walked over and extended a hand. "We would have never found that chamber without your message." Nolan shook his hand once. "You would have eventually." The deputy smiled. "Maybe." Nolan looked back toward the mountain. He knew that wasn't completely true. The changing landscape, the hidden passage, the overlooked drainage basin. Those pieces had only come together because someone had been willing to keep asking one more question after everyone else had accepted the answer. His phone vibrated. A message from his mother. "Lucy keeps asking if you're finally on your way home." Nolan looked east where the rising sun washed the mountains in warm gold. For the first time since the search had ended, he allowed himself a slow, quiet breath. Then he turned away from the ridge and started walking home. The mountains looked different in daylight. Not because the rocks had moved again, not because the forest had changed. They looked different because Nolan Mercer was no longer carrying the weight of an unanswered question. The rescue helicopter had long disappeared beyond the eastern ridge, and the emergency crews were slowly packing away ropes, stretchers, and climbing equipment. Conversation stayed quiet. Everyone understood how close the outcome had come to being very different. One of the rescue supervisors approached Nolan before leaving. "We're updating our search protocols after this." Nolan looked up. "What do you mean?" "The drainage basin." The supervisor unfolded the original search map. "We treated the terrain as if it stayed the same after the storm." He paused. "It didn't." Nolan nodded. "Mountains rarely do." The supervisor smiled. "That's a lesson we'll remember." There was nothing more to say. Nolan climbed into his aging pickup truck and began the drive home through winding mountain roads. The radio carried non-stop updates about Evelyn Harrow's condition. Doctors expected her to recover. She had survived dehydration, exposure, and a serious leg injury, but she was alive. Nolan turned the radio off. For him, the story had already reached its ending. When he pulled into his mother's driveway, Lucy burst through the front door before the engine even stopped. She ran across the yard and wrapped both arms around him. "You came home? I told you I would." She stepped back and looked carefully at the scratches on his jacket. "Did you find her?" Nolan smiled. "Yes." Lucy waited. He knew she expected a bigger story. Instead, he simply said she needed people not to stop caring. Lucy nodded as though that answer explained everything. Maybe in a child's heart it did. Over the following days, television stations discussed maps, weather, helicopters, and the difficulty of searching unstable mountain terrain. Experts analyzed the rescue. Reporters debated how close the operation had come to failure. Very few people ever learned Nolan's name. He never corrected them. He returned to inspecting flood gauges, repairing weather stations, and walking the same mountain trails he had always known. Life became ordinary again. One afternoon, several weeks later, Nolan and Lucy hiked a short trail overlooking the same valley where everything had happened. Lucy picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across a quiet pond. "Dad, yeah, if nobody knew what you did." She searched for the right words. "Would it still matter?" Nolan watched the ripples spread across the water before answering. "It mattered to the person who came home. That was enough." As someone standing outside the story, I believe its greatest lesson has very little to do with wealth. People often notice the word billionaire first because it sounds extraordinary. But the mountain never cared how much money Evelyn Harrow had. Cold rain treated her the same as anyone else. Darkness did not recognize success. Hunger did not respect titles. And hope did not belong only to the rich. The truth is that every human life carries equal value. A person working an ordinary job deserves the same dignity as someone leading a global company. A child waiting for a parent deserves the same love as the child of any wealthy family. Kindness should never depend on income. Respect should never depend on status. No one should ever be judged as less important simply because they have less money, fewer opportunities, or a quieter life. Nolan never chose to keep searching because Evelyn was famous. Had the missing person been a teacher, a truck driver, a nurse, a mechanic, or someone whose name appeared nowhere in the news, his decision would have been exactly the same. That is what gives his choice meaning. Not recognition, not reward, not headlines, only character. Sometimes the world remembers the people who are rescued. Sometimes it remembers the people who performed the rescue. But the strongest acts of compassion are often the ones that quietly disappear into everyday life, asking for nothing in return. And perhaps that is the kind of courage worth carrying long after this story is